Good afternoon and welcome to the Texas A&M Institute for Data Science Seminar Series 2022. I am Anne McNamara. I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Creative Works in the School of Performance, Visualization and Fine Arts. I'm also Director of the TAMIDS supported Vivid Lab. It's my great pleasure to kick off this series and I'm honored to welcome Vidya Setlur. Vidya is the Director of Tableau Research, and if you don't know what Tableau is, you should Google it immediately and start trying it out. And actually, I was reminded this morning that there's free educational licenses, so if you want to try out this very powerful visualization software, then all you have to do is sign up. So Vidya leads an interdisciplinary team of research scientists in areas including data visualization, multimodal interaction, statistics, applied machine learning, and natural language processing. She earned her doctorate in computer graphics in 2005 at Northwestern University. That's where I had the great pleasure of originally meeting her. Prior to joining Tableau, Vidya worked as a principal research scientist at the Nokia Research Center for 7 years. Her personal interests lie at the intersection of natural language processing and computer graphics. Her research combines concepts and methods from information retrieval, human perception, and cognitive science to help users effectively interact with devices and information in their environment. She's also the co-author of the recently published book, Functional Aesthetics for Data Visualization. And as a bonus for joining us in person today, we have 2 copies to raffle off. So I'm going to give each of you a little sticky, and you can just write your name on it. And at the end of the talk, we will draw 2 names and you'll get a signed copy, maybe signed copy. Oh,
worth a lot now.
Who knows? So welcome, Vidya. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Anne, for the kind invitation and hosting me here at Texas A&M. It's been a delight coming back here. I used to be at Nokia in Dallas, so it's always nice to come back and have some good Tex-Mex food. So as part of this talk, I am going to just talk about the concept of functional aesthetics and how it really plays a role in visual analysis. And I will be walking through a bunch of exemplars, some of it my own research over the years to motivate the need for thinking about both the function as well as the delight that comes with aesthetics when we're thinking about seeing and understanding data. All right, so imagine you probably all had lunch, but let's just imagine that we are at a restaurant and we are served a meal where there's this beautifully arranged black lacquered bento box. And one of the visceral pleasures that one gets when having lunch from a bento box is the arrangement of the food items, right? So there's an intentionality that is put into place when the food is juxtaposed with the various other condiments. The main dish tends to occupy the larger space in the bento box, and it sits coexisting with the other supporting food items as one takes part in this meal. So I will be revisiting this metaphor towards the end of the talk, and hopefully by then you will maybe appreciate the sense of form and function when we're thinking about data visualization, layout, and presentation. So I use the phrase functional aesthetics, and this is a definition that myself and my co-author Bridget came up with as we were thinking about the book, which we call a concept of combining perception, semantics, and intent so that they all function together as a whole, creating beauty in meaningful design. So we'll walk through this through a bunch of examples, and before I go into those examples, I really wanted to impress that this concept of functional aesthetics is a set of subsystems. So many of you might be used to the spectrum between pictographic artifacts to perceptual, but functional aesthetics also has an intentionality foundation that's built across that piece, along with the semantics layer that helps bring meaning into design. So as part of this talk, it consists of 3 main parts, and at the end, I'll hopefully try to bring those elements together. I'll first talk about the role of perception in seeing and understanding data, how semantics is important when thinking about visual analysis, understanding user intent, and how do we actually design interfaces and systems to support that, and how do they all come together to support functional aesthetics. So the first part is really talking about perception, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about visual perception, but just some examples to motivate the idea. So say you're looking at a table where you are asked to compare 2 numbers. And if I ask you a question, which product subcategory is the most unprofitable? You are probably scanning this table up and down, left and right to figure out the answer. It's going to take a few seconds to find that out. But how do I, if I make this easier by adding color, the unprofitable segments pop out in red, and it really indicates how powerful our human visual system is. We're able to decipher colors and patterns, but it's still hard to kind of look at these 4- and 5-digit numbers and quickly see where sales are the highest. You have to end up doing this comparison in your head. And I can make it even easier by converting these numbers into bars, where the quantity of the sales and the profit is encoded by size, or the length of the bars. And by looking at it, you can immediately spot which one is the most unprofitable. And to further make it easy, I've double encoded it with the colors. So brighter colors indicates that it's more unprofitable, along with the length. So, the data visualization community really built on this foundation of visual perception, but it's not as simple as seeing colors and shapes and form. It actually goes much more than that, because our brain is part of that cognitive process as well. So here's an exercise. Anyone brave enough to stand up and say the color and not the word on the slide? Okay, go ahead.
All right. Red, blue, green, yellow, green, black, blue, red, yellow, black, yellow, blue, green, red, black. That almost got me there in the middle.
Yeah. Good. So why was that challenging for you?
Because I just naturally want to say the word.
Yeah. So the speed of processing is slowing down because our brain is reading the words faster than the colors used, and it gets exasperated because the word and the color are not the same, and which is called Stroop effect. And this really plays an important role when we are trying to encode data. So let's take a look at this example. So I'm looking at produce. I'm a farmer, or I'm growing stuff, and I want to display the amount of the average produce for canned, fresh, and frozen. And if I were to load this into Tableau right now, it will be assigned these default colors. So for example, broccoli is blue, carrots are brown, corn is green, and so forth. So unless you've as a farmer, if I've created this weird genetically modified produce, this sort of is very confusing. Okay, should we take questions after?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So what we ended up doing was actually an algorithm that was able to take all these categorical items and find out what is the color that these items tend to be associated with. And for that, we actually used a Google Ngrams corpus, which is this digitized corpus that's out in the web that has color associations that you can get from a corpus of textbooks like blue sky, yellow taxi, and use that as a proxy to figure out the most semantically resonant color that one can associate with these colorable items. And immediately it makes the data visualization easier to process, because you don't have to really run this exercise in your mind as you're trying to disambiguate between the term and the color. So continuing on this topic of perception and understanding the world around us, we find that our visual environment contains a lot of information that can be processed without a glance. And one of my favorite artifacts is an arrow. And Barbara Tversky, who is a cognitive psychologist, has written a really wonderful book that
you have to do it.
I have to do it. Yeah. Okay, that keeps me busy. That really looked and studied the arrow as an artifact and how it can actually naturally encode path, direction, and relation. And the reason why I put this picture out was, especially during the pandemic with social distancing, the arrow became the norm, and people naturally knew what to do. How they stand in a queue, how much distance they need to maintain, where they need to go, and this marking is kind of a way in which perception is used to diagram the world. In addition to that, the presence of arrows are useful in interpreting diagrams. So here I'm looking at a pulley and trying to understand how a fulcrum works, and the use of arrows to indicate the movement as well as the effort that is applied on the lever makes the diagram intuitive to understand. And you can see that a physical phenomena, which normally would take a paragraph to explain, can be explained through visuals with the careful use of arrows and shape to explain it. So along the theme of diagramming the world, one form of visualization which continues to be inspiring is maps. So maps have early roots in information visualization, where cartographers spent a lot of time figuring out how information needs to be depicted to communicate a particular idea or a task or information about a geography. And generalization is a method where important information is emphasized, less important information is de-emphasized, so that semantically important features can be more visually distinguishable, and it reduces and resolves visual clutter, improving the overall information quality. And a lot of these early generalization operators inspired for maps has been a way to figure out how data visualizations can be rendered at different scales. So these operators have been applied to different charts, especially now with data visualizations showing up on an iWatch, in addition to a dashboard. We really need to think about scale and what sorts of information that we need to show. So this is a project that I worked on, which basically preserves salient visual features like the local maxima and minima and the endpoints, the first and the last data values, and keep those prominent all the way to the tiniest spark line that you see on the extreme right, while less important features like the tick labels, which may be of lower importance at a smaller scale, are removed. And I'll just quickly show a little video that goes through this. Yeah, I'm not going to turn on the audio, but you can kind of see the slider, which is on a desktop, and moving from a large line shot with all its bells and whistles into a tiny spark line, and then back up again. And so this is a combination of perception at work, but also really looking at the semantics of information, which I will talk about in the second part of my talk, to really influence the type of information that we want to present at a particular scale. So let me move on. Okay, so the key takeaways from thinking about perception are as follows. Representation is context, task, and data specific. So it's really important to think about representation, not in isolation, but relevant to what you're trying to do. And as part of that representation, figuring out what to emphasize and what to de-emphasize. I have just found in my research practice, figuring out what to de-emphasize and how much to de-emphasize is always tricky. It's very easy to emphasize stuff. You can pop stuff up, you can make it bigger, but how do you actually preserve the context of the other information without adding to visual clutter or making it distracting? And it's still a hard problem. But that really gets to, semantics, because semantics is a good method for trying to determine what is important and what is unimportant, and how context can be used to support that. And as a data visualization community, I think we have been pretty focused on the perception piece because the human visual system is pretty strong. But I would say that semantics has really started playing a role in different facets of the data pipeline, from data cleaning all the way to data presentation. So let me walk you through kind of the properties of semantics and how that plays a role. So, we as humans, we constantly seek meaning around our world, right? And there's a set of semantics when we're gathered around with friends at a dinner table versus us being at work or sitting here at a seminar, or just silently observing nature out in the garden. And as part of this pictographic to perception spectrum that I showed at the beginning of the talk, symbols are a powerful way to convey meaning. So if you look at these symbols, you probably can recognize the semantics of a majority of them. My favorite one is the croissant one. If you have little kids, that it's an alphabet card, and it's one way of teaching the alphabet using the shape of the object as well. And many of them are ubiquitous, right? They serve a particular functional purpose without using words through simple imagery. From the data visualization standpoint, one of the challenges with charts is they're inherently abstract. So here I'm looking at a Sagan plot, it's by Carl Sagan, showing the brain to body mass ratio for various animals. So if you're trying to make sense of this visualization, your eyes need to follow the dots, the labels, and the arrows as well. And you're trying to figure out a pattern here. But inspired by just symbolism and the semiotics around symbols, if we were to associate every animal with a semantically meaningful icon, all of a sudden the chart becomes more useful to understand, and you can actually glean patterns from it without having the same level of effort that you saw with the original chart. And this was one of the early research projects that I worked on when I joined Tableau, where we observed that a lot of Tableau customers would spend significant amount of time going out to Google, trying to find images and associating them with their sports visualizations or flags and so forth. So we really looked at a way in which we can automate or semi-automate that by including palettes of icon libraries with these categorical items. So till now, I showed you a bunch of examples where semantics and perception play a role in the actual chart generation. But there's more to that. Looking at the path from data to visualization, there are different steps and a multitude of them that need to be taken in order to create that final visualization, whether it's connecting to the data, cleaning it, transforming it, and so forth. And I would argue that semantics can play a role in every single part of the step. So here is one such example, which actually made it into the Tableau product. This was back in 2018. And it was a very simple but frustrating problem for our customers, where they would input data, like a CSV file or an Excel sheet, or it could be even a flat text file into Tableau, and the dates would be read or recognized as strings. And in order to convert them into dates, what we found was there are over 1,200 types of date formats that customers use all across the world. It's not just the little endian or the middle endian format. There's so many other nuances to it. And so we were trying to figure out a way in which we would not only be able to recognize a column of strings to be dates, but also the format of the dates. And if you look closely at this example, the second row, 4/15/2008, below the blue arrow, is a way of disambiguating the month and the day, right? Because there are only months up till 12, and so 15 cannot be a month. So it's actually month, date, and year. And so we looked at the context of the entire data domain, and we have some additional intelligence put in, like the locale of the workbook, to really not only recognize dates, but also come up with a plausible or a sensible date format. But this is kind of a very small and simple example where the context of the data can be used to understand the semantics of it. Another place where semantics plays a role is what we call semantic joins. A lot of times when we're joining multiple tables, we're really looking at equi-join properties where a column in one table is identical to that in another table, and you're just joining on that column. But many a times, tables that people are importing into a data visualization tool may not be directly the same, but they might be semantically equivalent. For example, a country code and a country. And coming up with ways in which we can identify semantic joins and trying to come up with sensible ways in which we can join these tables is another place where semantics plays a role. And so one of my favorite examples, which has gotten more nuanced, is I might have a table in US dollars and I might have another table in euros. And based on the data domain or where the author is, we can come up with a smart way of converting one currency into the other at the exchange rate of the date of the entire data domain, which is actually pretty cool. So, you know, we kind of take these operations for granted, but each of these operations, if they have to be done manually, adds a lot of time before one can create a chart. Sorting is another common transformation, and you know, some of the common ones are alphabetical, you know, numerical sort, but we also have sorts where, you know, you need to sort a Likert scale, and alphabetical sort is really not going to cut it because you need to go from something that's very negative to very positive. And so we have a corpus of survey data that we can use in Tableau that will take that information and try to come up with not only sensible sorting, but also reasonable palettes that can encode very negative to very positive information. So in my first example, when I was talking about dates, I did mention the importance of context to really disambiguate information. So location semantics is another place. So given that I was coming here to Texas, I thought I'd pull out this example. So there are all these cities, and I need to put these on a map, and I have it here. Do you think that this is the right answer? There's a Paris out in France, and then there's a cluster of points in Texas. I know it's a loaded question. It turns out, I didn't know this, but it turns out there's a Paris in Texas. And has anyone been there? Oh, you have. Does it look like Paris, France? And so when we first ran this algorithm, I thought it was a bug and it was not working well, but it so turns out that there is a Paris in Texas. So this is an automatic way of geocoding information if the latitude and longitude are not encoded by looking at the data domain to disambiguate. So I talked a little bit about how semantics has been used both in research and in the product, because a lot of this research made it into product to figure out ways in which we can use semantics to make these things a little bit easier. Another place that we have recently been looking at is data enrichment. And why is data enrichment?
If you hit the little arrow, you can use those.
Oh, okay.
The little arrow beside the chat.
This one?
Yeah, and just turn that off. And then
Brilliant.
everyone can chat all they
Brilliant.
want.
I always discover something new in Zoom. Okay, great. But so a new place where we're actually going now is figuring out how we can take an existing data column and enrich it with richer information. And I will show you some examples of how we use data enrichment later in the intent portion of my talk. But say I'm looking at housing data, and I have, various columns here like date, time, price, number of bedrooms, so forth. A common way of enriching data is adding synonyms and other related concepts. So if I have price, I can go to a dictionary and a thesaurus and find related concepts associated with price, like expensive. And because the definition of expensive has price in it, after we stem the words, we not only know that expensive is related or is a modifier of price, but it also belongs to a higher range of price, for instance. Another thing that we're looking at is kind of word associations, where that you have multiple words that may not have direct correlation with each other, but they are tied to the data column in the table. So if I'm interested in large bedrooms in this housing data as part of my natural language interaction, I need to have a way to support that by enriching the data. So having definitions for large and area as seen here in this example, and trying to come up with common words or bags of words associated with those, we can come up with kind of a corpus of words associated and its properties associated with various columns in the data. And we have kind of really performant ways of storing that and indexing it when we try to use this data in natural language interaction, which I'm going to be talking about very shortly. So the key thing about semantics as it plays a role in thinking about functional aesthetics is semantics is a really concrete way to recognize meaning in data and to make sense of it. And it's really playing a huge role as the industry and research at large is moving to more NLP and AI techniques to really bridge the world between automated machine-generated analysis as well as understanding data. And with the foundation of perception and semantics, we can support some really interesting experiences around conversing with data, which I am going to get to in this third part of the talk, where I will be talking about this concept called analytical intent. So intent or analytical intent is defined as a goal that a user has when they're exploring their data. It might be serendipitous, exploration and discovery, or they might have a specific task in mind, like they want to find a correlation or they want to compare numbers. And in the past, including with Tableau, some of the original tools out there, realizing intent was very literal. People would just pick a bunch of data attributes and say, I want a scatter plot or I want a bar chart. But it's actually gotten a lot more nuanced than that, especially when we're thinking about expressing analytical intent through language. And why is that challenging? So as we know, language by itself can be very complex, even when we are engaging in conversation amongst ourselves. And imagine trying to teach a machine how to parse language. And so there is this spectrum of what I call very concrete concepts. Something is the tallest, something is the cheapest. Can't really argue about it. It's very objective. But then it gets really fuzzy when you say, tall athletes. What does tall mean? For basketball players might be very different from tall for, average women height in India, for instance, or expensive houses in California versus expensive houses in Texas. It's a day and night difference, right? So it's really subjective. It depends on the data, and it's really hard to come up with the bounds that define that concept. And then it gets even more fuzzy when it becomes very subjective. So if, along the example of house buying, what does a good neighborhood mean? Is it a good walking score? Is it good schools? Is it low crime rate? Is it all of the above? So it really differs for different people. But what we found is when we give people a natural language interface, they tend to use this type of language that they would normally take for granted when they're talking with a human. And so we started exploring this at Tableau research, where starting in 2016 roughly, and it's still ongoing work, where we came up with a natural language interface, which we call Divisa, that supported people in asking these free-form analytical questions based on their intent, and get responses as charts. And my favorite example is I gave somebody at Tableau this interface, and I said, this is earthquake data, type in something. And the first thing they typed in was, find large earthquakes near California. And it seems simple, right? This person wanted to find large earthquakes, but it's very challenging because what does large mean? What does near mean? They're kind of fuzzy. And I think the AI community has moved away from getting an answer completely right to, let me give you a guesstimate and I will expose that to you, and you can tweak my guesstimate or my assumptions, and let's have a conversation with each other about it. So we decided to come up with some estimate. In this case, we looked at Wolfram Alpha and came up with, large could be a magnitude of 5 and greater, near is, within 100 miles around California. And we provided these sliders to the user, and the user could tweak those sliders, and that setting was saved for that person. But then it got even more challenging because, when we're having a conversation with someone, I'm not going to say, Anne, where should we go for lunch? And she might say, yeah, let's go to this taco place. And if I say, Anne, where should we go for dinner? She'll think I'm a little, nuts. It's very natural if I just say, hey, what about dinner, right? So it's called language pragmatics, where we omit certain words because the context is brought to that conversation. And we saw a similar behavior when people were interacting with the computer interface. So people would be like, how about near Texas? And this was also new to me. I didn't know that Texas has earthquakes. The magnitude is not as big as that of California, but yeah, it does have some earthquakes as well. And so we had to actually take words from the previous context, like large and earthquakes, and try to bring that into the next conversation. And it actually gets more challenging because near California is very different from near in Paris or near in Boise, Idaho, because you're looking at the geographical density of an area to kind of parse the term near. So we've been kind of exploring that interplay between language and data. And Divisa actually led to a natural language product in Tableau. And the reason why I'm kind of bringing this up is you might ask a question, it's like, cool, this is all fun research. How much of it is actually going into the product? I wouldn't say all of our research goes into product, but a decent amount does. And so after Divisa and after we kind of came up with this way to repair and refine system assumptions through widgets, we came out with a natural language feature called Ask Data. I have the URL here, happy to share the slides after as well. And things like expensive wines are shown as a widget, and people can actually tweak that setting and save it for their data set. So one of the things that I'm recently looking at is really delving into the use of external knowledge. Like Wolfram Alpha is a really great resource for units. A lot of times people will ask a question in a different form than the units in the data set. Wikipedia has an events corpus, which is really nice to provide explanations to temporal events. So that is another external knowledge corpus that we're looking into to really kind of support things like this, highest and lowest temperatures in Fahrenheit over fall, and assuming that the data is in Celsius and we don't have seasons embedded in the data, it really needs to do things that are more sophisticated. And it turns out this data is in the southern hemisphere. So it shows the maximum and minimum as annotations, indicates that it's the southern hemisphere, and also indicates the month range. So it's a way to expose the provenance of what the system is doing under the hood and allowing the user to understand what's going on. And this model of repair and refinement has been a very successful model for a lot of modern AI and natural language systems concerning data. One type of question which is really hard to pinpoint are these whys. You know, what is the drop in July? Even though this person said what, they actually mean why. So if I'm looking at the pound versus dollar fluctuation and I'm curious about that dip, going to say Google or New York Times headlines and getting some information, parsing that and bringing it and providing an explanation in the annotation is something that we're looking into, because a lot of authors, when they're creating annotations, often spend a lot of time doing this. So can we provide some reasonable defaults to their data so that they can tweak and modify that, reducing the amount of time taken to create this? Now, what I was talking about till now is this analytical conversation with data, but you can also have an analytical conversation with the dashboard, right? It's like, what is a spike in that blue line? Spike maps to the line chart in the dashboard, needs to map to that blue mark, and it needs to highlight that spike. And so there are multiple steps that need to be done to really bridge the gap between language and visual properties. And while supporting conversation and providing scaffolds for repair and refinement, we're also looking at ways in which we can do kind of autocomplete while people are typing in their questions. So I'm going to quickly play a portion of this video snippet, not all of it, so you can have a look. So I'm looking at a COVID dashboard, and as I'm typing, you'll see things popping up. And it says, show me cases in, and it will show a map widget, so I kind of know the distribution of COVID cases. And I can click on it, and it'll select US and update the dashboard. And if I say on, it prompts a calendar widget, and it shows me the intensity of cases. So I'm not like shooting darts in the dark. I can have a more informed decision of the type of questions I want to ask in natural language. And providing this auto completion that's based on data for someone to complete their intent through language. The next thing that we are looking at more recently, and this is kind of getting towards the end of my talk, is I don't know how many of you use Slack or Microsoft Teams, but Salesforce recently bought Slack. And even before Salesforce did that acquisition, so Tableau is part of Salesforce now, we have been looking at going beyond kind of the traditional dashboard, that Tableau supports, to other forms of media, including chatbots, voice as well. And some of the principles that we have developed with desktop type of natural language interfaces do transfer over, right? It's like over here, I'm looking at the Titanic data set. This is a Slack bot, and I'm interacting with the Slack bot. And I ask a question, show me who survived, who did not survive. It shows a chart, but it also gives me a drop down so I can change and filter on the chart as well. But what we realized is the medium really dictates how these sorts of analytical conversations happen. Slack has its own limitations as a platform, and we have to really understand how people use that so we can support these forms of conversation. We're also looking at other form factors where you can talk to an echo show. I have just found that a lot of executives at Tableau tend to get excited about having an echo show on their nightstand and saying, how are my sales doing this quarter? But I haven't really seen too much adoption beyond that, but it's still something that we're looking into. Also looking at like sports data, fitness data, and trying to pop up information on different form factors, and the types of questions people ask, and the ambiguity in language and how that is expressed can get really challenging, especially with voice. You don't have the luxury of a drop-down widget. So how do you actually correct and re-clarify any sort of system mistakes? Yeah. So the key takeaways from the intent piece are when we are thinking about developing either interactive visualizations, dashboards, or systems to understand user intent, we also need to facilitate ways in which users can repair, refine, and disambiguate concepts. The use of scaffolding is really important, whether it's through auto-completion or widgets. And pragmatics, data, and the medium all really need to work together to support this cooperative conversation. So what does that all mean when we're bringing it together? So revisiting this bento box metaphor, and this is something that I touch upon in the book. Obviously, with time here, I could not go through all the details, but it really kind of takes something like this, like an ordinary dashboard, which is presenting donation campaign information, to something like this, right? So it's not just adding pretty colors to this. I mean, if you flip between this example and this example, it's showing one campaign type. It's adding lines and annotations to draw your eye to certain portions of the dashboard. It's making the collect donations button really prominent at the bottom because that's the intent of the author. And so we have kind of a range of heuristics that really get through the perception, the semantics of the data being shown. If you see here, there's a semantically resonant color palette associated with the bar charts, and making sure that the intent of the author is reaching the audience through careful design. And I will say that visualization has really gone beyond an enterprise organization using data visualization to look at sales data to something that's really become ubiquitous in our life, right? So the flatten the curve metaphor from the COVID pandemic has really been a nice example, where you see the chart on the left shows a comparison between two cities, Philadelphia and St. Louis, and it shows two forms of line trends. One with people taking appropriate measures in curbing the spread versus a population that doesn't. And this became the flatten the curve abstraction, which really became ubiquitous, and we found a lot of leaders using this as a way to inspire people to partake in social interventions during the pandemic. And so it has really morphed into a visual vocabulary in 2020. Related to that is the use of computer vision, AI, and analytics in new forms of sectors and domains, like the restaurant industry. A lot of people during the pandemic would take out food. So kitchen management and understanding the operations flow of food order to food prep to food delivery had to be done well. So a lot of kitchens actually started installing sensors in their kitchen to really monitor bottlenecks. And we created this dashboard for a local Palo Alto restaurant as an experiment to see if they can actually use a dashboard in a way that's useful for them to identify bottlenecks in their kitchen management. And so we've definitely seen a trend towards new domains where people are thinking about data. Data ubiquity, as I said in the previous example, sensors are everywhere. We have a lot of smart appliances around, looking at their usage. I mean, I was monitoring my sprinkler system and the water from my cell phone and looking at the usage. So there are kind of new ways of thinking about data visualization rather than someone going to a laptop and understanding data. How can we actually bring data visualization to where people are also in the field? And with that, this is a link to our research Tableau website. If you are interested in reading papers, both the work that I presented at the talk as well as from my team, that's where to go. If you have any questions or comments, you can find me through email or Twitter. And I have a shameless plug. I brought a couple of books, you know, to do a giveaway. But yeah,